Welcome to the Reuters Institute and a very warm welcome to all our fellows, of course, to our wider audience as well. This is a continuing conversation that we have through the course of our fellowship program, where we try and reach out to stories and journalists who've really made a difference in the area that they work in, and perhaps something for everyone who's listening to take away from those conversations. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, John-Allan Namu. Welcome to you. A quick context for those who may have heard of his work or not heard of his work. He's been an investigative journalist for many decades now, started off as a TV reporter and now has a startup of his own. Perhaps I shouldn't use the word startup because it's been around for a while, Africa Uncensored. A lot of his work has been investigative in nature, and I reckon it hasn't been easy. It has often put him in the line of fire. It's often put him in some extremely uncomfortable situations, as perhaps his extended family as well. There's a broader conversation to have in the context of where journalism is headed across the world on what one should expect as an investigative journalist, what comes with the turf, and what kind of collateral damage and emotional damage journalists might have to often deal with while working in that arena. John, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for making time to speak with us. I know you've got a busy schedule over there. Let me launch into a little bit of context first, because I know you've been this scrappy TV journalist for many years now, the one who didn't want to go down the television anchor mold, the one who wanted to do a lot of deep dive stories. Tell me how the birth of your organization happened and why you chose to move away from what is often the glitzier part of journalism, which is within a TV newsroom.
Thanks a lot, Mitali, and thank you for joining us, everybody who's on this call. I'm really grateful that people have chosen to speak with, to hear me speak for a couple of minutes. So to your question, why did I start Africa Uncensored? I felt, well, I mean, a personal ambition. So I've always wanted to be kind of like the master of my own fate, in a sense, journalistically speaking. Choose the stories that I want to do or think are important. Try and raise the banner a little bit in terms of public interest journalism in our country and in our region. And also for more, industry, having observed certain industry-wide trends, the business model was starting to fail a little bit at around the time that we made the decision to jump. We had been, and by we being myself and two of my co-founders who we worked together with, had been at the sharp end of attempts to censor our work, attempts to manage, to editorialize our work. And we felt that Kenya, and I say this with due respect to everybody else in the region, Kenya is too important a country, journalistically speaking, to not fight back or to not have some sort of response against that kind of censorship, which we saw starting to creep in, especially from the security state. At the time we were fighting, Kenya was in a very serious phase of its war against terrorists, the Al-Shabaab. And we, fortunately or unfortunately, were the journalists who were questioning a lot about some of the moves that were being made at that time. And so those were some of the motivations that led us to start Africa Uncensored.
Interesting. We broaden it to the topic that we're talking about, because it's not an easy context, investigative journalism. It's certainly not easy in the life and times that we live in at this point in time. How would you describe what that means, the emotional toll of investigative journalism? What does that mean to you?
That's a really big question. And big because I think when in investigative journalism, especially in our region, is characterized, and I guess in other places as well, is characterized by this specific kind of stereotype. It's hard access, it's dodging bullets, it's threats and all sorts of things, and to a large extent that's true. But I think what seeps in more deeply, some of the experiences that you have, speaking to people who themselves have been at the sharp end of things. themselves are facing all sorts of challenges in their own lives. And as well as the toll that it takes on you as a person, having to kind of live through, relive, or listen to these traumatic experiences and live through them, vicariously. Those are the things that kind of seep into your bones. And for me, the emotional toll is one that has built over a long period of time. And you have to find certain ways of creating pressure valves within yourself to try and release. It is the toll that also comes from just the mental labor that comes with any sort of in-depth journalism. That the long hours, the time away from family, the guilt about that time away from family and friends. When it's no longer a badge of honor, because early in your career when you say, I'm busy, I need to work, it kind of is a badge of honor that you kind of wear proudly because you've got the job, you've got the opportunity, you're starting out in your life. But as you settle down and make a family, as you try and reconnect with your own roots and your past and certain people that you might have left behind, you also find that they've kind of moved on without you. And so dealing with just sometimes being everywhere and not being rooted, in one place can take a bit of a toll on you. Yeah. And I think this is something that a lot of journalists experience. We speak to lots of people on a daily basis, but there's so little time to create or to develop deep connections. And so your circle of friends is very, very small. Your circle of friends is really, tight. And there's only so many people who kind of understand what it is that you go through on a daily basis. And then many times they go through the same things themselves. It's a long answer, but I hope I've given you something that kind of makes sense.
You have indeed. Perhaps let me flip that question just to sort of analyze this another way, because for people looking from the outside, it's often something that comes with the turf. Andrew Jennings, for example, the famous investigative reporter who exposed corruption in very large sporting bodies, often said, the cue for an investigative reporter is when everyone's going in one direction, you go in the opposite direction. Is that something that, comes with the badge? Or do you think that's overstated? The point that if you're an investigative journalist, there's going to be emotional collateral damage. There's going to be a life that's quite different from how other journalists even function.
Well, to a large extent, it's true because you see, everything or a large part of an investigative journalist's career is spent either on their own or on their own physically or on their own mentally, where they are contending with certain very heavy facts and heavy sets of information that perhaps not everybody else knows. And that's the requirement, that you be the person to dig, you be the person to do the unpopular things, you be the person who has to figure out a way of asking the tough questions repeatedly and developing a reputation for being for not being liked in some quarters and for people to be very mistrustful of you, even in everyday things, everyday exchanges. Like, and I'm certain this is other people's experience. I'll go to a restaurant, or I'll go shopping or something, and someone comes and says, hello, hi, how are you? And we get into a bit of a deep conversation and they want to tell me something and they're like, oh no, but don't record me, or don't report this. And they always think that you're on the clock. So in a sense, you kind of have to develop a certain kind of, not, I wouldn't say cavalier attitude towards some of the responses that people have to you as a person, but to understand that there's a certain perception that people have of you. And it's developed mainly because of the kind of lifestyle you've chosen and the kind of career that you've chosen. So there's a balance there. You kind of have to try and understand that, yes, this many times solitary life and career that you've chosen does have consequences, does have things that, that will be difficult for you to be able to establish. Yeah.
We've got you on a slightly scratchy line, and I hope everyone can hear me.
I'm sorry, it's really windy here, so
yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is.
yeah, I'll
Um,
try and move to a less noisy location if you give
that's
me a second.
fine.
But as you're asking your question, so I'll
Yes.
just switch for a second. Yeah.
I get to the more personal aspect of things that you have experienced yourself and your family has, John, through the course of your investigative reporting. Let me ask you what you think has changed over the last decade or so, because the observation for many journalists, particularly those doing work that may be uncharitable to ruling administrations, is the fact that it's far more legitimized now. There is state-sponsored pushback or large organization-based pushback, and that can be quite difficult for an individual journalist or an individual newsroom to fight against. Is that a change that you've observed as well in the last couple of years, that this is far bigger and far more organized now when they try to take down the journalist for his or her work?
Well, certainly, and I think there's certain trends globally and locally that have announced this kind of shift. There's a professional colleague of mine, a friend, Nanjala Nyabola, who always tries to remind people that even as people who are engaged in journalism, in civil society work, etc., are trying to organize to be able to build on our democracy, to be able to open up means for accountability, etc. Um, there are people whose job it is on a daily basis is to claw back these kinds of advances, to be able to create systems, governments even, that revolve around concepts like negative nationalism, subnationalism, and portray the world in a very, very different, very, very you know essentially the antithesis of what it is that people are doing. And I think with the aid of technology, um, they've been able to find their 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 villager, to be able to find their community, I should say, and empower them by sort of legitimizing the fact that if you have numbers, if you have people who believe in it, in what it is that you believe, it doesn't really matter whether that what your beliefs are unethical or might cause strife, but that they are totally legitimate and deserve their place in the sun. To an extent, in a marketplace of ideas, that is true. But when it becomes something that overawes every other idea, that starts to victimize and to target specific groups, then you know that that's wrong. And unfortunately, nation states are learning this from one another.
You've had your own traumatic experience while you were working on the Pandora Papers. You took on the Kenyan president. Share with us what those months looked like and what your deepest were really through that period.
I think the trauma for me, and I'd shared this on a thread in advance of this conversation. I think the trauma for me was a lot of them. It was deeply personal and a bit of a debate with myself in my mind. And so what happened was, of course, with the story on the Pandora Papers, we were taking on the most powerful family, not just the president, but the most powerful family in the country at the time, and exposing things about them that they may not have wanted exposed. For some people felt, and quite legitimately, that it wouldn't be a good idea for my family and I to kind of hang around and see what the responses to the story would be, and asked us to go and lay low for a bit, and to pull the kids out of school, stay in a ratty apartment somewhere for about a month. And that's fine. That's okay, because again, I don't want to try and wear this as some sort of badge or some sort of burden that I've carried alone. This has been the experience, and much worse for a lot of investigative journalists around the world. But why I say that the battle was more one of a mental one was because at that point in time, with the kinds of reactions or no reactions, little reactions that the story elicited, with the kind of misinformation that came up around the story, it really forced me to think about why it was I was putting my family through this. And you see, whereas I've developed those shock absorbers for these kinds of stories over time, my kids haven't. and they're now at the age where they can truly question my work and the things that I do. And those were some hard conversations to have. And people don't realize this about journalists, or that it's not just one person behind a byline. There's a family, there's a community of people who are impacted by anything that happens to that journalist. And I mean, for a long spell there while we were away, I guess maybe because I had the time to think about it, I really did think about just hanging up my boots and moving on to something a little easier, a little less threatening, a little something that doesn't get me awkward stares or silly questions like, are you recording me, or make me the ire of politicians and elite and people in the elite that I haven't met or even done stories about. Those kinds of things kind of started to percolate. And I just wondered whether in my own desire and ambition to want to continue doing investigative journalism, whether I was offering my children and my wife a normal life. And that's a heavy thing to ask yourself, because this isn't a normal life. And is it fair for me to impose this on them simply because I have that ambition? It certainly did change the matrix of why it is that I do what I do. And I think in the long term, it will inform or give me a bit of a richer understanding of what it is and why it is I do what I do, and why it is that I'm still in this profession. Um, Ultimately, and again, I don't want to seem like some sort of martyr or sacrificial lamb or something like that, but ultimately there have to be those of us who naively choose to be naive in our belief that journalism does change things, and that the work that we do, though insignificant as one piece or as two pieces, over time builds a body of work that can talk to the better angels in our society, and that can expose the wrongdoing over time, that can speak to systems. And and it you have to kind of try and explain that over time to the people who love you. um yeah, so I mean, if I'm honest, and you can see I'm still thinking about this as we go along. It's not a complete answer. It's kind of like a living document of responses to to the kind of things that people face.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, yeah, I'm choosing to be naive about what the impact of our profession can be. And no matter what happens, hopefully what I'm saying will be borne out by time. you know Time is our friend after all, and maybe it'll prove me right, I hope.
Thoughts in motion. um, it's what you say is unique to you, and yet not unique in the sense that this is something so many journalists over the world are struggling with, John. I think particularly in more intimate conversations, they've also pointed out that they would feel less vulnerable, especially if they didn't have children, where you're not looking over your shoulder to wonder about what their future or their prospects look like because of the road that you have chosen to go down. In that moment when you were really hunkering down, what were the two or three things that convinced you that you would like to stay with the path that you've chosen? And I don't mean this on a very broad-based philosophical manner. I genuinely, want to know the thoughts that came to your mind, because I think that's probably what journalists in very tough circumstances do question. And I'm wondering what worked for you and might also work for someone else listening to this.
Particularly, or specifically to the Pandora Papers, was that I was part of of such a big sea change in the way journalism is starting to be practiced. That we are not lone wolves, but we are a community of practice, who are willing to collaborate for the greater good, in a sense. That was really, really reassuring. Also, that at that point in time, in as much as my family and I were in this situation, but I wasn't alone. That also helped. But third was, I think, just knowing that in as much as perhaps the work that we didn't quite have the impact that we had thought it might, that it's out there, and it can't be taken back. People can attempt to bury it, people can attempt to do all sorts of things, but it can't be taken back. The genie is out of the bottle, as so to speak, on various previously unknown aspects of offshore finance, etc. And being a part of that, that part of community of journalists who worked on the Pandora Papers was it was and I think about it, a highlight in my career. So those are the things that kind of kept me going, and of course on a more personal level, um, my wife's constantly telling me that we've been through worse, and she's been quite a pillar for me. And I guess maybe in terms of advice, it is to find your pillars, the people who are your pillars of strength, that you can draw from in those specific situations when you just feel like your well is empty. Yeah.
One pillar I imagine can and should be your editor. It should be your network and your fellow journalists, and perhaps even the larger community. What was your own experience, and what do you bring to the newsroom in your own organization as best practices for an editor or a group of fellow journalists or a community of journalists to support someone who's trying to do work that is essentially dangerous in nature?
I think what we've established at Africa Uncensored, perhaps because we were small, and we still are small, and didn't have much of the same resources as a bigger newsroom might have, was that everybody pitched into the work and was allowed to pitch into the work at whatever point, be it because we built into our gatekeeping processes a group preview of our documentaries, and adding that kind of commentary and seeing that it's being taken, adding your comments and seeing that they're being taken seriously. The second thing is we've taken quite seriously the toll that mental trauma has on journalists, and we're constantly leaving our doors wide open for people to have these kinds of discussions in open fora, but also in more closed circumstances through professional help. Those two things, I'd say, are the things that uniquely are part of our practice at work, that I'd say are really important, to just let people know that it's okay to have down days, or even down weeks or months. Okay, in the sense that everybody does go through these things, and to figure out where we can get the resources to support journalists who are going through this kind of stuff. I think that's been an important part of and perhaps a difference between us and the newsrooms that I've worked in the past. That those resources are available, and more than that, the openness and the attitude towards issues of mental health is not one that it's, oh, this is a disease or this person has a problem, but no, this person deserves our attention, our help, our support, both within the storytelling and the product that is journalism, but as an individual who's going through something and possibly might not be able to talk about it quite open.
This is sort of parallel to the idea of the emotional toll of journalism, but I think it's important because of the practices that you have talked about. In some of your previous interviews, I noted that you talked about not trying to be a hero, not trying to get that shot at the risk of your own life, pairing reporters and producers in male pairs, encouraging reporters not to investigate or report after dark. Is that something that is a process in your? I'd love for you to share that with people listening.
Yeah, so like more practically, the things like, especially for dangerous stories, is having risk assessments, figuring out what the risks are and the lay of the land before you go into it. But also just recognizing that if a story is too dangerous, just pull away and it'll be okay, right? We'll figure out other ways of being able to tell the story. It's in those things that we've put into our editorial policy and our practice that have allowed for us to be, to have survived as long as we have, for these 7 years. And I think one other thing, one other thing that we do when it comes to stories that are dangerous is also trying to limit the people who access information even within the organization, allowing for there to be sort of like silos when it comes to the protection of certain kinds of information. But also explaining more broadly to the organization, the people who are in the organization, that there are certain things that are happening. And finally, it would be training. So ensuring that journalists have, as part of daily practice, certain kind of hygiene around how they treat their information, certain kind of knowledge about how to counter surveillance, which is something that we're trying to build now and over time, and certain, protocols when it comes to being in dangerous or hostile environments. I think those are the things that we're trying to continually inculcate as practice at our organization that have been helpful.
What can the larger community of journalists within your region do, John, in order to support their fellows who are doing investigative journalism? In environments where increasingly there is anti-bail jurisprudence, for example, or there is a general tendency for governments to push back and to create more stringent measures in the guise of government stability or political stability. It's not my beat. I'm a political reporter or a business reporter, but what can I do to support someone who is doing investigative journalism?
The first thing is a build relationships with people in the region. I'm actively always trying to seek out new friendships within the profession from people who are not in Kenya. And I know, for selfish and unselfish reasons, I know one day I will need to call on some of these people in case the legal environment in Kenya changes and veers more towards a security state as we're seeing in our region. But also because I know that they're going through certain kinds of restrictions or are part of or are reporting in particularly difficult climates that I may not understand, but need, at least at the level of being a journalist and wanting people's stories to come out, to support. So I'll give you an example from the 2021 elections in Uganda. There was an internet shutdown there. There was a journalist who, was really, really like a very good investigative journalist who I respect, who reached out to me to manage his Twitter account. And when, content on breaking news came out, for me to tweet on his behalf. And it's things like that seem small, but are practical, measurable ways that you can assist someone being able to do their work. But also when it comes to times in which journalists are in danger or are facing certain kind of strains and stresses from their work, to speak up on their behalf, because sometimes they just don't have the bandwidth to be able to do so, both as individuals or even within the environment that they're operating. It's really important to be those kinds of, again, pillars of support for people within the region. Yeah.
Since we have pivoted to politics, you had perhaps the most competitive presidential election in August this year. Expectations are high, I mean, from other regions as well, in terms of what Kenya could move to. Eyes are very keenly on your independent institutions and what they may do to uphold what is just and right. As a journalist who's working on the prickliest end of the bar, have you noticed any changes? Do you see cause for hope, for instance, in terms of how journalists are treated or how organizations that try to do investigative work are treated?
I think right now it's too early to say. I think it's still really early in the new regime's rulership for us to be able to establish what kind of presidency, what kind of rulership this will be. Certainly, one thing that concerns me is the religiosity that leadership has been approached with in this specific regime. Because what then it denotes is that if you are sort of like propping up one religion, then it means people of contrary beliefs, etc., might not have the same space or bandwidth to be able to express themselves. But again, it's too early. I'd say that what certainly is reassuring is that at least at certain levels, especially senior levels, the government appreciates the challenge that we're up against. You know, from an economic point of view,
Yeah.
it is a difficult time. It's a difficult challenge, and I think they appreciate that, which is quite reassuring. Yeah.
Okay. I have many questions for you as well, but I am conscious of time. And as is form and practice, I would like to open the floor first to our journalism fellows. There's a whole bunch of questions. Perhaps I'll just go in the order that they've been streaming in. Leda from Zambia has a question. Leda, we'd love to hear what you'd like to ask John.
Hi, John. Thank you for making time to speak with us. You mentioned that as an investigative journalist, sometimes you are mentally on your own. And you've also mentioned some things that your family has had to go through. And you also mentioned that sometimes you maintain a very small circle, but then that circle has gone through similar trauma. So, do you think collective healing for both the investigative journalists and their families can be considered as an option?
Sorry, collectively for investigative journalists, you said what?
Collective healing for investigative journalists and also their families. Do you think that can be considered as an option?
Oh yeah, certainly. I think it's important to think of the journalist and their work as something that doesn't just impact them. So it's really important to try and figure out what the ecosystem for support is, not just for the journalists, but even for for people who work behind the scenes, producers, etc. But also for family members. How do you support these kinds of people at points in time that their matriarch or patriarch or family member is in need? How do you ensure that the family can be strong enough to be able to support them? Mitali, can I just ask that I switch off my camera? There's a lot of movement around me. And I'd like to continue the conversation, but it might be a bit distracting if my camera is on. I'd also like to move to a quieter location.
Absolutely. What we'll do is queue up the next question for you while you resettle yourselves. It's truly a journalist on the move, pun intended. Let me switch over to Regine from the Philippines. Regine, go ahead with your question.
Okay. Hi, John. I hope you can hear me, and thanks for taking the time off to chat with us. I'm from the Philippines, and I want to ask how you handle with sources who might be difficult, particularly not just sources who are politicians or people in power who might have felt slighted by the investigative work, but sometimes there are also other types of sources, maybe in communities or people whom you seek to help, but who are not satisfied with how the overall outcome.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. Can I can't hear your question.
Once you're settled, I can.
Could you just repeat your question again?
Are you settled now, John?
I am. I caught part of that question, and I think, yeah, it was about difficult sources.
Yes.
About difficult sources, and perhaps I can just sort of transcribe this for Regine. It was about what happens when sources turn a bit hostile, when the story goes, larger than they had expected, or when they are nervous for their own consequences of having participated in that story.
I think, interestingly, I was asked the same question at a training that I was moderating today. And the first thing to do is, in the situation where perhaps the source is trying to confront you when you're doing like a right of response interview, is to pull away immediately. To recognize that sometimes it's better to lose the story than lose your life. But secondly, when you start to recognize that sources are being um, aggressive or hostile, I think it's to raise it with your organization. Make sure that there are certain protocols in place, because you'll have known how sensitive your story is in advance of doing it. Is to have certain protocols in place to ensure that if the journalist themselves is not available to carry on with the story, and it can be taken up by the organization, that the role of the journalist, at least in terms of perception, can be minimized, for that particular story. So bylines, withheld, etc. But finally, I think it's to just ensure that there is as loud as possible a criticism and a pushback against this kind of hostility.
Frida has a question.
Yeah, it's a little bit of the same theme as Regine, but my question is, I'm Frida, sorry, from Sweden. And my question is about the pushback, which I figure you know will come, hard or massive. But how do you prepare your team around the article, the report, on how to handle the pushback, both emotionally and among the facts that you have to defend, maybe?
That's a tough one, because in as much as we can do risk assessments, we can prepare them for the pushback. At the end of the day, there's no accounting for, especially, and I'll speak to this one specifically, especially for what happens online and the kind of trolling, etc., and that impact that it can have on, on an individual. You try to be as supportive as possible, but there are certain kinds of things that you can not prepare a journalist for. I think what you just need to do is be available to them, as the leader editorially, and show that not just show in person when you're with them, but in public, that you support the work that they do, that you stand by it. One of my former editors told me that an editor's job is two things: guidance, so to guide a journalist when they are going wrong, and protection. And what protection means is literally that you must protect them when they are under attack, especially unfairly.
Mm. I think this is also a good segue, and I would love for you to share with our fellows and the audience as well, John, a story where for you as well, it was a tough spot when you were covering a story around Felician Kabuk, and there was a wrong ID, that went out on that story. Tell us what happened, because I was struck most by your observation that you were afraid this would then throw a bad light on all the other work you had done.
Yeah, the Kabuga story was a doozy. Just for context, Felician Kabuga at the time that we were reporting was a genocidaire from the Rwanda genocide. He had been missing for 18 years, and no photograph had been taken of him for 18 years. And so when one of our sources came up with one, we shared it with our editors. We previewed the story multiple times. And then we ran the story only for it to have been proven to be a false photograph. I can tell you that I won't speak too much about my own sort of like personal feelings about that. But the fact that we had those protocols in place where the story was previewed and previewed and previewed, but also because I had a supportive editor. I was able to retain my job. And that's speaking to exactly what I was talking about. Had he not stood up for me, had they not protected me, then we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. And it was really instructive and really motivated me to know what my job would be if ever it came down to protecting a journalist who made perhaps a well-intentioned but bad mistake. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think
Mitali, I'm sorry. I think I only have time for one more question. I do apologize to everybody because we were supposed to be on for about an hour, but I am being called away now.
I understand. And if that is the case, may I sort of take over the reins here and request Ronson to place his question. For context, John, Ronson is our fellow from Hong Kong who has faced not dissimilar circumstances as yours and has been reporting as well against quite a bit of pushback. Ronson.
Yeah, my question is simple. That maybe you have mentioned that. Maybe I missed. Sorry. I'm just concerned that any laws in Kenya that will threaten your investigative reporting, and you have any ways to protect the investigative reporters, for example, some legal aid or assistance for you guys.
If there's been assistance that's come our way in terms of legal aid.
That's
Is that
right.
what you're asking?
Yeah, volunteer legal aid or some kind of assistance for reporters who are often.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's various organizations that have been very helpful to us. The Committee to Protect Journalists, for instance, the East Africa chapter has always been supportive. There have been various non-governmental organizations whose job it is to protect civil rights defenders that have looked at journalists as civil rights defenders, that have stepped in and stood in the gap for us. There is a growing understanding that what journalism does is often at the nexus between perhaps private practice and public interest, and a journalist's jobs are being seen increasingly as important to the democracy of our nation and our region. So that support is definitely there. Yeah.
John, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining in. We had such a long list of questions, so we are honestly sorry to see you go, but I understand that you've got a packed schedule and it's been very, very good chatting with you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
I hope there's something for investigative journalists across the world to do today. But most importantly, I think the importance of community, something we try to really foster at the Institute, comes through. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you guys, all of you fellows. I think you guys have a brilliant program, and please continue encouraging these kinds of conversations. I think it's important that we stop and reflect many times as journalists. Asanteni, and have a great day ahead. Bye.
Thank you, John, and thank you to everyone who's logged on. I hope there's something to take away from this conversation. We will be back, of course, next Wednesday with another chat on our global journalism series.